Hello everyone. Good evening. Again, it's been a long while before we are meeting each other. Today we are again going to discuss a topic and discover it newly. I'm not going to take much time. We will directly go into the topic. Discover people's pulses. No, that's the topic. So before we move ahead, let's start debunking few myths that are there prevalent, especially in India. So the first thing is, you know, many of us, especially in India, if you are someone who is a movie watcher, you would have seen people identifying whether the woman is pregnant or not by palpating pulse. That's what is shown at least in movies. Well, that got debunked for me in my first year of MBBS. Till the time I was believing it to be true, but later then I got to know that it is not true. It was very early in my first year. Now, the next myth that is there is, oh, we know what pulse is. No, or yeah, I know the types of pulses or what happens. No, so we are going to debunk that also, that aspect also today. So what is going to happen is you're going to get introduced into a world of pulses. And believe me, we are just going to scratch the surface of that world. But at least it is like we are going to start scratching the surface of the world. Okay. After that, again, it's like it's going to be on us how much we're going to practice and apply. Okay, so we'll right away move into the topic now. So I'm going to start sharing the screen now. So discover people's pulse. That's the topic. First, let's discuss the definition. So, pulse definition of a pulse. A pulse is a transmitted waveform with a peak and trough transmitted through the arterial wall that precedes the blood flow. So, if you look in the definition, have I highlighted two aspects? It's a transmitted waveform. So, waveform will obviously have a peak and a trough. It's not that difficult to imagine that part. What is important to get is the concept that it precedes the blood flow. Okay, so what gives you the pulse is not the blood that is pumped out of the heart. Okay, many of the students still think that the pulse is provided by the blood. No, the actual pulse that you feel or what we define is preceding that blood flow. So let's get a little deeper with respect to the meaning. So if you look at this picture and you compare the movement to the heart and this rope to the arterial wall, the action that she generates is going to generate waves in this rope. Now that is what is pulse. If you look, there is no blood being pumped out, or there is no, uh, except for the action of the arm which moves the rope, there is nothing else propelling this movement. Okay, so now this is the heart. This person you can imagine her to be the heart, and this to be the wall of the aorta. Then you see like the pulse is generated by purely by the heart action and not by the blood that is being pumped. Okay, so now one more thing that you can also notice is the grip. If the grip held is weak, then the pulse is not going to be that stronger. So this also speaks about the relationship between the heart and the aorta. So how strong the heart and the aortic connection should be such that each heartbeat, your heart is beating as we speak. How strong the grip has to be, how strong the attachment has to be for each heartbeat to get transmitted through that aortic wall. And you can palpate that pulses in almost all the distal arteries. Okay, and that's how strong the connection between the heart and the aortic wall is. Okay, uh, just it's important that you understand this concept before we move ahead. Okay, so let's see what aspects do we describe when we are talking about pulse. This chart gives you the whole of the things that are described: rate, rhythm, volume, character. You're going to have a comment on peripheral pulses, which we will discuss in some future sessions. Radio-radial delay, radio-femoral delay, and condition of the vessel wall. So whenever the pulses you're palpating, you can describe condition of each vessel wall, the respective vessel wall that you're palpating. In this session, we are going to limit the discussion to only character. Okay. And first thing is, whenever you are going to describe the character of the pulse, the examination is done in the carotid arteries. Okay, it is like commenting on the character of the pulse after palpating the radial artery, as done by many, may not be that accurate. In fact, every character has to be defined in the central arteries whenever possible, that is the carotids. There is one aspect of examination which will involve examining the peripheral pulse, which is if you want to demonstrate a collapsing pulse or a water hammer pulse, you will be palpating the radial artery and the forearm. Okay, again, that is for another session, that you can see like that is the only character for which if you want to describe that aspect, you will be using the peripheral artery, which is the radial artery with forearm. Okay, so this is a picture of the normal arterial pulse. So see, I we spoke about how the pulse is getting generated and how it's purely the heart muscle wall, like that wall contraction, that is generating the pulse. But the topic that we have taken today, the character, it is given by the volume. It is given by the blood pump along with the heart wall activity. Okay, so this character of the pulse is dependent also on the blood that is being pumped. So the amount of blood being pumped, how it is pumped, all those things will define the characteristic of the pulse. Okay, so let's see what happens to the normal arterial pulse. Okay, if go to the deep of pulse generation and try to really exactly simulate the arterial wall action, this is how it will look like. So it will have a steep percussion wave, which is like a increased slope, and then there is a anacrotic notch. For the sake of convenience, I've split and shown, but you can see that in even one wave. So this will be the percussion wave. This is the anacrotic notch and the shoulder. Not just like the shoulder, human shoulder. You can see this aspect and compare it to anacrotic notch at the shoulder. Then there is a tidal wave, which is a rounded peak, less slant, and then there is a dicrotic notch, which is in the descending limb. Okay, so this is a descending limb. They have a dicrotic notch, and this dicrotic notch coincides with aortic wall closure. So like blood is being pumped, the character is given by that, but the heart is in contraction. That's when this the arterial wall is being pushed like the rope that you saw. It's going to be pushed to generate the upside wave, and when the downside wave is happening during diastole, that time when the aortic valve closes, there is a sudden elevation of the pressure which happens within the aortic wall. Okay, and that is represent like the descending limb, and there is sudden elevation. This is happens when there is aortic valve closure, which will steeply increase the pressure within the aorta for a transiently, and that causes such elevation before the descending limb continues. Okay, so this is a deep theory part, but when you are examining the patient, like you're going to touch the patient's arteries with your fingers, the three fingers, again the technique we will discuss in some other day. So when you are touching the arterial wall with your fingers, these are the moments of the arterial wall that you may appreciate, right? But normally that doesn't happen. It's this will be only for the theory. So what happens in actual examination? Representational normal arterial pulse. So this is what you're going to feel when you're touching the artery with your fingers, the tip of the fingers. Okay, so you're going to have a ascending limb and descending limb of a wave, a simple waveform. That is what you palpate, because first thing is you're directly touching the aorta, you're touching the arteries which are representing the contraction that's happening. So all those fine movements get smoothened out. Okay, in fact, what you can touch is the percussion wave, the initial steep, that is the thing, not the tidal wave. You are going to touch the percussion wave, and then there is a dicrotic. So there are no notches or shoulders that you're going to see in such pulses. Okay, so let's look into the type of pulses, the characters. Hypokinetic pulse. And I'm also dividing the pulses in pairs or combinations so that you can remember with ease. And before we begin the specific aspect, I want to give you a hint. Uh, it doesn't mean that a patient with a certain condition has to have a certain pulse. For example, there is something called as pulsus parvus et tardus, or slow rising pulse, that is seen in aortic stenosis. Okay, which I'm going to describe that pulse in today's session, but I'm just taking an example of it. So all patients with aortic stenosis need not have that character, that type of a pulse. A person with aortic stenosis may have a normal pulse. Okay, but the classical description of the pulse, that is what we are doing. Okay, so again, as we go to a session, I will explain that a little deeper. Hypokinetic pulse. Let's understand the term hypokinetic pulse. The kinetic, the moment, the motion. So what you're palpating? The arterial wall. The motion of that arterial wall is hypo, slow moving arterial wall. When you touch the finger, what you're going to look for is slow elevation and slow descent. Okay, that's what the term means. Well, the tortoise denotes the same, the slow moving creature. Okay, so now you see the normal pulse wave, which is in dotted line, superimposed on a hypokinetic pulse. So what happens here? Hypokinetic or hypodynamic, decreased dynamicity, decreased kinetic property of that. You see the slope is slow, so the rapid ascent is not happening. It's a slow ascent and slow descent. And this is what students may confuse it with. It is not necessary that the amplitude of the wave has to decrease. Though I have shown it in this picture as with a decreased amplitude of the wave, it need not be. The slope can be slow and still have the same peak. That is one. The next thing that students confuse with is hypokinetic pulse. They confuse it with bradycardia. That is also not true. A patient with hypokinetic pulse, like a slow rising and slow descending, can also have a normal pulse rate or sometimes even tachycardia. Okay, so these are the things that you need to debunk. Hypokinetic means only slow rising and slow, like you touch the pulse and you see that the wall is slowly rising and slowly descending. That's it. It doesn't mean it has bradycardia. It doesn't mean it is of low volume or anything of that sort. Okay, now the next thing is, now again the caveat. Though it can be like that, hypokinetic pulse is usually associated with conditions which have bradycardia. For example, hypothyroidism. And it's not necessary. I'm again saying it's not necessary it has to happen only in hypothyroidism, but I'm putting forth an example which can be associated with bradycardia. Remember, I'm going to give you a character of a pulse and one cause for it, so that you recall, your ability to recall it becomes easy for you. But it's not limited to that. So hypokinetic pulse, hypothyroidism may or may not have bradycardia, but hypokinetic pulse may be there. Okay, and touching that aspect again, all patients with hypothyroidism will not have hypokinetic pulse. They may have a normal pulse. But if someone asks you what will be a characteristic pulse in a hypothyroidism, maybe the answer could be hypokinetic pulse. Okay, so let's move to the next. Well, the same tortoise, when it is inside the water, it is faster definitely than me. I don't know much of swimming. So hyperkinetic pulse is the opposite of it. So the ascent and the descent will be steep or faster than the usually expected. So you touch the uh, arterial wall with your fingers, and the ascent and descent will be faster than expected. That will be the hyperkinetic pulse. So obviously the condition, you can take the classical example being hyperthyroidism. So you again see here the pulse wave. This is a normal dotted line. That is the normal arterial pulse, which is collapsed with the hyperkinetic pulse. So you see the ascent is little steeper and it is bigger amplitude, and the rate which is same. Okay, so the rate can be slower, same, or faster with this kind of peaks. The same way the peak could be lesser than this, more than this, or equal to the normal pulse that you would expect. What we are concerned with when we say hyperkinetic is the wall of the artery is moving faster rate. That's it. Okay, so again it is independent of the rate and the length or the amplitude of the wave. So this goes for hyperkinetic pulse. Let's go to the next pulse. Pulses parvus et tardis. An example that I took in the beginning. So if you look at this horse, and if you compare this with another horse, which is seasoned horse, which can run faster, and you compare to this horse, you will see it will be slow rising one. That's why I just put a picture uh, to describe this pulse. So let's see what happens. This pulse is also called as slow rising pulse, or some also call it as anacrotic pulse. Okay, so pulses powers at tardis. So what's happening here? This pulse is seen in aortic stenosis. It's a classical characteristic pulse that is seen in aortic stenosis is pulsus parvus et tardus. Translation, it translates into slow rising pulse. Okay, so what happens here in aortic stenosis? The caliber of the aorta is reduced. The blood enters from left ventricle to aorta. That is like defining the character for a normal pulse. But in aortic stenosis, as the blood is being pushed into aorta, it confronts the stenosis. The caliber of the aorta is reduced. Okay. So what happens? The blood cannot be immediately pushed. So what happens in the initial aspect of the contraction, ventricular contraction, the blood is not sufficiently pushed because of the constriction of the level of aorta. So the pulse slowly rises. But at one point, if you look, if the mitral valve is closed, then the blood can't go anywhere else except for aorta. And the ventricle contraction, the amount of force generated within the ventricle exponentially increases at the mid and late systoles, right? So at that time, what happens? Then the whatever the retained blood is there, that also is pushed. Okay, so at that time, the peak may almost be similar to the aortic wall. So what you will pick when you're touching the aortic wall in arterial wall in pulsus pavas et tardus is the initial slow raising pulse. Okay, and the rate may be the same and the amplitude may be the same. So this defines pulsus pavas et tardus. Next thing is collapsing pulse, or also called as water hammer pulse, which I said sometimes you will have to demonstrate in the periphery, radial artery. But we'll just understand the concept here. The collapsing pulse is seen in aortic regurgitation. So what happens in aortic regurgitation? The blood is pumped from left ventricle to aorta, and then from aorta, instead of only maintaining a forward flow, suddenly the blood, like diastolic during diastole, it runs off again into the ventricle. So if you're someone who is touching the neck, you will see the blood being pushed into the aorta, and then suddenly it will, during the diastole, it will diastolic, like it will run off again to the ventricle, called as diastolic runoff, because the aortic valve is not competent. Okay, so also called as aortic incompetence or aortic regurgitation. So why this picture? So if you look at this, the glass here, the hourglass here, you see a narrow opening here for the mud to enter. I want you to imagine something now. Consider this is something which is like not a narrow gap, but the whole cylinder of the glass. And there is half, like the aspect of this is water. What is going to happen when you turn the hourglass? Okay, and if there is no air, no resistance, what's going to happen is the whole of the volume is going to hit the other side. Like you turn this and it's going to hit the other side. So there is a water hammer is something like a closed test tube with with an aspect of it filled with water. So you turn the tube this way, the whole of the column hits the other side with a sound of a hammer, like a metal being hit. That's called water hammer. Okay, now that's the sound or the feel that you have when you're touching that pulse. Like it hits and goes off, it hits and goes off. Okay, and does it's not sustained hit. Okay, so how will it look when you want to touch the arterial wall? Well, first thing is you see the ascent, it's almost the same. The peak is little higher end, and then there is sudden descent. There is no symmetry. Ascent is higher and descent is sudden. Again, the word that you need to remember, keyword is diastolic runoff of the blood into the left ventricle. Diastolic runoff. And I also want you to get that here the amplitude is dependent. The amplitude is going to be increased. Now, why? When the blood that is re-entering the left ventricle during diastole, it adds up to the next cycle blood that is getting accumulated in the left ventricle. So the left ventricle now receives blood not only from atria, the left atria, but also from aorta. So the increased pool of blood in the left ventricle, that causes more force to be generated, resulting in increased blood ejection. So you will have a steep ascent and a higher amplitude, but a sudden fall. Okay, like someone standing and someone collapses like that. Your blood, the arterial wall steeply rises, like you can sense the pulsation, like it's like really good, and then suddenly it falls, collapses. Okay, and that's called collapsing pulse, seen in aortic regurgitation. Okay, next is pulses bis varians. The letter you need to remember is S. Okay, and also you can remember it's a mix. So we just now discussed pulse that is seen in aortic regurgitation and before that aortic stenosis. So this pulses experience is seen in a condition where there is mix of both. There is aortic stenosis and regurgitation. So the valve that doesn't allow the blood to go out also doesn't prevent the blood from coming back to the ventricle. Okay. So now what happens? Here both the pulses are mixed. So if you look at this aspect, the slow rising, that is an aspect provided by aortic stenosis. Okay, and then the descent is very sudden, like a collapse, that is provided by the aortic regurgitation. And what is the S that I wanted to tell you, like wanted you to remember is, you see like there is two peaks in systole, like one peak during the ascent here, one, and then the second one. So what is giving these two peaks? One is, we also we now understood that during aortic regurgitation there is increased blood flow, like backflow into the ventricle, so there is increased force. So what happens, the slow rise, because the increased volume that is generated, the the aortic wall is stretched at a point beyond its flexibility, produces the first peak, and then the whole of the volume is getting slowly emptied, that produces the second peak here. So there are two peaks in systole, one because of the increased volume and next because of increased contraction provided by the endostic fiber length, which is increased because of increased blood inside the left ventricle. Well, in short, it is about Frank-Stallings law. We will discuss that law some other time, but the answer to that is Frank-Stallings law. So the increased fiber length gives increased force of contraction. This causes two peak, one peak because of the flow, other peak because of the increased contraction. Okay. So again, this is addition of just simple addition of aortic stenosis and aortic regurgitation. Moving to the next. So dicrotic pulse. So there in systole there is in pulses bisphereans, the letter you remember is S. There are two peaks in systole, right? In dicrotic pulse, the letter you need to remember is D. But what you may automatically convert it to is two peaks in diastole. Well, it is not possible. You cannot have a wave with two peaks in diastole. Try drawing it. You will see that you cannot draw two waves in diastole without any wave in systole. Okay, so you have to have a peak, one in systole, one in diastole. Okay, so we will show the picture now. So dicrotic pulse, the letter you remember is D. So what happens? One peak is there in systole and the other peak is there during diastole. Now, interestingly, you can also notice that a normal pulse has one peak, dicrotic pulse has two peaks. Okay, logically, should we say it is like a more stronger force, stronger pulse? No, it is not. The example where you see dicrotic pulse is in slow flow states. Maybe now you understand why I have put this picture, a snail, a slow flow state. Classical example being heart failure. Okay, so what happens here? Let's understand the logic behind this. If you consider this as a capillary and then the blood flows, right? And when the blood flows, if you look at the contraction, how the blood is ejected out of left ventricle, you can imagine to have a drop-like feature with a head and a tail. So if you look at this as a head and a tail, and this is the arterial wall, it hits and expands. So this is when you will feel the character of the pulse. Okay. Okay, so I'll just repeat that again. So what is going to happen in dicrotic pulse? It is happening in slow flow states. A normal heart pushes the blood it's like a tear drop. It's like a drop, and this is the arterial wall. When the initial flow is hit, the head hits, the wall expands. That's when you feel the first peak, right? And then it goes to the tail end, where the arterial wall relaxes. Normally, the tail is narrow and the head is vast, like the big. So you will have only one peak during systole. So that when the arterial wall comes back to its place because of its elasticity, it tries to come back to its original place. It is going to hit against the tail, which is narrow, so it doesn't have any resistance. Now, what happens in slow flow states? First of all, the heart is weak. The force is not that big, so the heart blood that was pumped in pulses, like pumped in columns, like a teardrop, it is not going to happen. It is going to be reduced in intensity. Okay, so the blood column that is now being pumped out of heart weekly has not well described head and tail. So the artery wall is not stretched that much. It's like the whole slant. This is how it's moving the blood column slowly. So it doesn't stretch much, but you have a peak because blood is coming. And then when the arterial wall tends to relax, again gets to own position, it again hits the same column because the tail is now not narrow. It is almost the same. So it slightly rises and slightly comes back and again hits the volume. So this is how you're going to have a dicrotic pulse, right? You see this? But it was a if it was a normal contraction, it would like push the arterial wall, you get the peak. When it comes back, it's the tail end. It doesn't have to relax. But in slow flow states, the head and tail is not well defined in the pulse, so it is like it pushes, but the arterial wall again comes back and it's the same volume. So you will have one peak in systole, one peak in diastole. So the thready pulse is also something like that, which you will feel in the peripheries. It's not like you will have a multiple peak like thing. It's like thready, that is happening in shock. That is because of slow flow states. Okay, that's about dicrotic pulse. Next is pulses alternans. One of the easiest pulse to understand and remember. It was not as tough as dicrotic pulse. So let's look at this clock. Um, I think most of you would have at least seen a clock which ran out of battery, and it would, uh, some seconds it would skip showing. The place where it has to show 5 seconds, maybe it was pushing itself to 4 seconds, right? When the motor is defective or the battery was wearing out. Now, pulses alternance is something like that. It is a direct reflection of a weak heart or a heart that is damaged. Okay, and here, if you want to narrow it even more, it is the left ventricle that is dysfunctional. So the pulses alternance is seen in left ventricle dysfunction. So how it translates, the heart beats irregularly, like alternatingly you have a high peak and low peak, high peak and low peak. It doesn't have to be of same amplitude, but you get a sense of what happens with that dysfunctional left ventricle. It is going to erratically beat up and down, and that's directly transmitted into the waveform inside aorta and what you feel in the peripheral arteries. Pulses alternance, alternating high and low beats. Classical description is that. Next is pulses bigemini. So the letter you need to remember is G. The picture that you're seeing is of digitalis purpurae, because this condition is seen in digitalis toxicity. Okay, it's a glycoside. So again, there is a G. So let's remember this again. Pulses bigemini. This is the only pulse which we are describing has a letter G, which is dominant Gemini G. It happens in glycoside toxicity or digitalis toxicity, which we use, digitalis or digoxin that we use, a cardiac glycoside. So what happens here? The pulse beat in pairs, like bigemini, two, and then there is a this in a normal pulse you would have retained one more in between, but here in bigemini there is a mist. So you will hear, like you will palpate two beats and then pause, and then two beats, and then this cycle repeats. Okay, this is pulses bigemini, the letter G. Next is pulses paradoxes and reverse pulses paradoxes. Well, this needs you to understand a concept that happens inside the heart, the mechanism that happening inside the heart. So we will go and discuss that little deeply. Pulses paradoxes. Well, by definition, what happens? A normal pulse or a normal like pulse during inspiration falls. Okay, like you see, like patient is asked to inspire, like breathe in, and then the amplitude of the pulse decreases. Okay, this is pulses paradoxes. Well, that is at least what you feel. But if you go into the theoretical definition, it is a fall in systolic blood pressure by more than 10 millimeter of mercury. Okay. So now let's look at the mechanism. I know definition is easy to understand, but let's look at the mechanism. Why pulses paradoxes and what's happening inside there? Well, if you imagine this to be a heart with a typical diastole, and your focus will be on the ventricles and the arrowheads. The arrowheads are showing the outer side, it means like the ventricles are relaxing, and the blood flow. This is the venous blood flow in blue and the arterial blood flow in the red. So during typical diastole, this is what's happening. The blood is entering from the left atrium and right atrium to left ventricle and right ventricle respectively, and the left ventricle is getting filled. Typical diastole. Now, what happens during inspiration and diastole? So, if you look at now, what happens during inspiration? Like everything else is same except that it is a diastole during inspiration. So, when patient breathes in, the negative pressure that sets up inside thoracic cavity sucks the blood out of the leg and also from the head region to increase the volume load inside the heart. And the receiving end of the heart is the right side. So the increased blood that enters the right atrium and right ventricle is going to cause the chamber enlargement, which is disproportionate to the left side. Number one. And then what happens? If you look at the left ventricle now, you see the right ventricle and left ventricle, which were symmetrically shaped in the previous diagram. Now you see that right side is pulled in more, and there is a bulging. And this is the septal wall, which is bulging into the left ventricle. And this is a free wall, which is also bulged, okay, compared to the left ventricle. So this bulging decreases the volume inside the left ventricle, and the less the volume, the character is going to be little, like the weak, the pulse is going to get weak, and that causes the fall in the pulse or the systolic blood pressure. Okay, and if you look, this is normal. I'm not describing any particular condition. I'm saying in a normal heart during inspiration what happens. So the fall in systolic blood pressure during inspiration is expected and normal. That's why some authors don't agree with the term pulses paradoxes, because there is no paradox. It's expected. What's happening is expected. Only thing the definition separates it is an exaggerated fall. So what it means, normally it should be less than 10 millimeter of mercury fall in systolic blood pressure, but in pulses paradoxes there is more than 10 millimeter mercury fall. So let's understand simple logic. Why will that happen? The condition that you see this is in constrictive pericarditis. Okay, so what is happening in constrictive pericarditis here? Here, the free wall of the right ventricle is not independent to move. Okay, it is constrained, constrictive pericarditis. This free wall is not moving. So the increased load is going to happen on the left side only, like the septal wall. Okay, sorry for that. So here you see what's going to happen is the left ventricle is even more compromised because of the bulging septum in constrictive pericarditis, because this is the only wall that is now free to expand and move, which is inside the heart. Outside this is constricted, it can't expand here. Okay, this causes an exaggerated fall, which is constrictive pericarditis. Okay, so let's look at the reverse pulses paradoxes. So simple diagram again. So what it says, instead of fall, it increases, it raises by 10 millimeter of mercury, if that is the definition that fits, right? So the pulse that is normal during inspiration, it raises. Now let's get into the mechanism. Well, this condition is seen in hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. Repeating the cause again, hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. So let's look what happens in diastole in hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. So what is the hypertrophy denote? Here denotes to hypertrophy is the septal hypertrophy mainly. Okay, and then obstructive. What is the obstruction here? It interferes with blood flow from left ventricle into aorta. So this is the obstruction that it is causing. Okay, cardiomyopathy, disease of the heart. Okay, so hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. So again, these are diastole. What's happening is blood is entering from the respective atrium to the respective ventricle in a patient with HOCM, right? So now let's see what happens during diastole or like systole in HOCM. So blood, the arrowheads are changed. So the ventricles are contracting, trying to push the blood here inside. So what's happening here? If you look, the blood that is entering into the left ventricle have to curve around this obstruction. So naturally, the volume that is entering the aorta is less, causing a weak pulse, right? So that's what happens in a normal, not I would not say normal, generally in a patient with HOCM. Now, what happens during inspiration? What differently happens in inspiration? Well, during inspiration, what happens is the increased volume that is entering the right atrium, and the septum is actually thick, thick, and it's not being pushed. So the increased and this changes has happened over years and years. It's not like one beat. The patient had HOCM from a long time, long duration, right? So the volume equalizes so that the amount of blood that is increasing in the right atrium or the and ventricle is reflected on the left side also. Okay, so what happens there when this Now the wall is not being pushed here during inspiration. One. Next thing is the increased volume is being that is received here in right half of the heart, also reflected on the left side of the heart. So this increased volume that is being received like gives a two hit to the heart. One is it pushes the septum like or arranges the configuration of the chamber of left ventricle in such a way that the obstruction is cleared off. Hypertrophic obstruction. So the hypertrophied septal wall is getting out of the way and the obstruction is getting cleared. So what happens? The increased volume is generated one during inspiration, and the next thing is suddenly the obstruction which was there, every heartbeat that was being obstructed, which was obstructing the flow from left ventricle to aorta, suddenly moves away from the flow direction, right? So what happens? Increased volume is suddenly ejected. So in such patients doing inspiration, because the flow is increased and the obstruction is taken away, you will feel the pulse in a stronger way. The arterial wall suddenly starts expanding, which will be reflected in increasing blood pressure during inspiration. Okay, this explains um, um, reverse pulses paradoxes. So the reverse is happening than what is expected in pulses paradoxes. So this is systole, again showing you what's happened here. So you see in diastole, the increased blood is being received, and during systole, the chamber configuration is changed such that the flow is easy. It doesn't have to curve around the obstruction. It's like from left ventricle directly into the aorta as if it was normal. So this increased flow happens within the left ventricle during inspiration, causing reverse pulses paradoxes. So during inspiration, the pressure increases. Okay, so we've discussed the characters of all the pulses today, which is classical, which is expected a student to know. I hope this session was helpful, and we are going to search for any questions. If you have any questions, please start typing them now. There's a lag period, so if you don't type it early soon, we may end the session before your question is reaching us. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. Okay, so waiting for 10 seconds for any questions. If there are any, we want to stop. And one more thing, first of all, thank you for spending your time to watch this video. Um, I know it's a hard time. Many students currently are like all the day it's online classes, and we are taking one more thing, adding one more thing. But the intention is only is get the concepts clear, so that you are not only just knowing something but know how to apply, and you're going to serve patients. That's the one thing. And I also want to let you know the concepts, that is, if you find this concept interesting and you want to know more, now we have the book that is created, called Doctor's Assistant, your partner in clinical practice. So the description of the book and the link to buy the book will be there inside the description once the video is uploaded. Um, your support and encouragement is very much required. And if you find our videos interesting, please do share with your friends and encourage them to buy the book too. Okay, and it's available in Kindle version. We don't have a paperback available for now. So I am expecting your support and encouragement in carrying this work. Okay. So I don't see any questions. We will end the session now. Thank you. Thank you for spending time with me. Take care. See you again with another short session. Bye.